Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining our call today for a status update on the International Space Station and commercial crew programs. I'm Leah Cheshire. We're here at NASA's Johnson Space Center, and joining me on the line today are Ken Bowersox, Associate Administrator for NASA's Space Operations Mission Directorate, Steve Stitch, Manager for NASA's Commercial Crew Program, and Dana Weigel, Manager of NASA's International Space Station Program. We're going to give our participants some opportunities to provide opening remarks today before getting into the question and answer portion of our session. We've recently had some technical difficulties on some of our conference calls, so our conference line will be moderated by the call moderator during the Q&A portion today. We already see some of you in the queue, but a reminder, if you have a question, press *1 to raise your hand and press *2 to lower it if you hear your question answered. We're going to get started with those opening remarks, and so I will turn it over to Ken.
Hey, hello, everybody. Thanks for joining us today. As always, we appreciate your interest and the time that you're spending with us. I know everybody's eager to hear about what's going on orbit. We've got Steve Stitch and Dana Weigel from the ISS program and commercial crew program to help you with any information you might need about what we've got going on in our different program efforts up in low Earth orbit. We like to share information as often as we can. Our tendency is to wait until we've got really clear information to provide you on decisions that we're making. In the current situation we have on orbit, especially with Starliner, that information has been slower to develop. It's kind of interesting. Our decision-making process at NASA can run really fast, or it can take a while. What you find is that the speed of the decision can vary with the clarity of the information you're working with, the amount of uncertainty in the problem, the time that you have available, and the number of options that you have to deal with issues. If you talk Starliner in particular, we're in a kind of a new situation here in that we've got multiple options. We don't just have to bring a crew back on Starliner, for example. We could bring them back on another vehicle. That's something that we're going to have to deal with in the future. We could find ourselves in a situation where we need to bring a Dragon crew or a Soyuz crew back on a Starliner. That's why we want multiple vehicles, is so that we have that option, but it gives us a lot more to talk about in our decision-making process. In the case that we have with the Starliner crew flight test, the option to either bring the crew home on the Starliner or to bring the crew home on another vehicle, we could take either path, and reasonable people could pick either path depending on where their view is on our position in the uncertainty bound that we have for the data that we've got on the thruster system, on the propulsion system. So moving forward, what we're trying to do is reduce that uncertainty, see if we can drive some more consensus amongst our team. At the same time, getting more serious about evaluating our other options. It's been really great to watch our team working, our Boeing team, our NASA team, the way people are speaking up, the way we're hearing different voices, different thoughts on how critical different factors are in the decision. I think it's been very healthy. I have to admit that sometimes when we get disagreement, it's not fun. It can be painful having those discussions, but it's what makes us a good organization, and it's what will get us to a good decision as we approach that point here in the future. And I don't think we're too far away from making that call. We know that at some point we need to bring Butch and Sonny home. While they're up there, we have extra crews, we have extra hands. They can do a lot more work, but they're also using up more consumables, more supplies. So we have to maintain that balance, and at some point we need to bring those folks home and get back to a normal crew size on the ISS. But again, I just want to say how proud I am of our team and the way they have these open discussions, open conversations, and the way we're working through the data gathering and analysis process. Today, Steve will talk to you a little bit more about what we have going on in the commercial crew area, and Dana will share more information about what we've had occurring on the station side and the Cygnus that we just brought aboard the other day. Now I'd like to turn it over to Steve so he can share more details from his point of view. Steve?
Yeah, thanks, Ken, and thanks to all of you for dialing in today and all your interest in the Commercial Crew Program and human spaceflight. I'd like to start off by giving everybody an update on where we are with respect to the analysis, in particular on the thrusters and the flight rationale for the return of Starliner. And then I'll talk a little bit more about the manifest changes we've made and what we've done to give ourselves some flexibility in the near term relative to all the options that we're looking at. So if we start with Starliner, last time we talked a lot about the testing results at White Sands. We had completed the thruster testing, which was essentially two uphill profiles trying to get to the temps that we saw on this particular thruster, and then we really have done 5 downhill profiles with that particular thruster. We were able to replicate degradation in the thruster during that testing, and we saw that continually on the downhill side with the thrust levels degrading over time, which seems to mimic what we're seeing in flight to some extent during those downhill profiles. As we talked about during that testing, we gained insight into what we think one of the contributing factors are for that thrust degradation, and that would be this Teflon seal on the oxidizer line poppet. Now, this poppet's really small. It's about, if you hold up your little pinky finger, it's about the size of that, a little bit smaller even than your pinky finger, so it's a small poppet. But what we saw during that testing is the swelling of that Teflon seal. It kind of extruded a little bit, and what happens with that seal is it blocks the flow into the thruster itself, down into the combustion chamber. So we know that's happening. We know we can get vaporization when it gets hot in that line, bringing propellant into the thruster, and also when that poppet is blocked by the Teflon seal, we see some cavitation. In other words, unsteady flow across that poppet. We have some animation that we hope to be able to release soon to you so you can see what this is like. Boeing has been doing a lot of work on that animation, and hopefully we can have them share that soon so you can get a better idea of that mechanism as well. We also have this same theory that has some vaporization of the propellant, right, and it drops the thrust. So there's really two key things that we think is happening. One, when the thruster gets really hot, the propellant can vaporize. That's where we saw the really low thrust readings on docking day, and then as the poppet swells, we can get some blockage there based on what we learned at White Sands. What we're trying to do now is sort of understand what all that data means to us from the White Sands testing, and then what it means to the thrusters on orbit. We did do a hot fire while we're docked to the International Space Station on Saturday, July 11th. We wanted to understand the performance of all the thrusters across the vehicle, so we hot fired all 27 thrusters. We did not hot fire one thruster in the bottom doghouse. We call it the B1A3 thruster. That one had really low thrust before during the when we were docking back on July 6th, and so we did not, or June 6th, and we did not hot fire that thruster. The interesting thing when we hot fired the thrusters is all the thrusters now across the whole vehicle are essentially at nominal thrust level. So, for example, the one that we were really saw the most degradation in, T2A2, was at about 80% before the hot fire, and now it's about 98%. So somehow, if the poppet is the theory of what's causing the thrust degradation, the blockage in that ox flow, somehow that piece of Teflon must have contracted and is now not blocking the flow like it was, and so we have a nominal flow essentially into that thruster and nominal thrust. What we're really trying to do now, that gives us a lot of confidence in the thrusters, but we can't, totally prove with certainty what we're seeing on orbit is exactly what's been replicated on the ground. We're trying to understand a little bit more about the conditions that cause the thruster fail-offs. It's not always at the same temperature. It's not always at the same number of pulses, and so we're trying to understand that. We are doing modeling on the ground to try to understand how this Teflon could extrude, what the forces are on that Teflon, and then trying to understand how it could contract how it could contract over time. People really want to understand the physics of what's going on relative to the physics of the Teflon, what's causing it to heat up, what's causing it to contract, and that's really what the team is off trying to understand, and then look ahead toward the downhill phase and the heating on the downhill phase, and seeing if we can model that on the downhill phase and ensure we have good thrusters. Again, as I've talked, we have really good knowledge of what the downhill is, but how does that really help us out? So, in combination with that, we have tried to buy ourselves a little bit of time to work various options for return. And so recently this week at the Program Control Board, just yesterday, we approved moving the Crew 9 mission to no earlier than September 24th. We took that to the Program Control Board, and it was approved, and we immediately put out a blog to make sure that everybody knew that we had made that decision. We appreciate your patience over the last few weeks. It took a little time to work with SpaceX on that movement of that flight, and also with the ISS program, because it's a very complicated manifest. In addition, we moved the Crew 9 mission off of Pad 39A onto Pad 40 to deconflict with the pad preparations in September for NASA's Europa Clipper mission, which is flying off 39A with an October 10th launch date. So we've been working the certification of Pad 40 for a long time. We've always wanted to have a backup pad for these kinds of scenarios, and so that work has been underway for some time, and we think we can get that certification completed in time for a September 24th launch of Crew 9. We will let SpaceX use our first stage booster. They'll go fly a Starlink flight ahead of our flight to get a little shakedown of that booster. It had some moisture intrusion, and we want to go ahead and get that booster flown. And so there's a win-win there with flying our booster on a Starlink flight before our crewed flight. Essentially what we are doing is we're taking the SpaceX 31 slot that was out there in the manifest, and we'll let Dana talk more about that. As we've said before, our prime option is to return Butch and Sunny on Starliner. However, we have done the requisite planning to make sure we have other options open. And so we have been working with SpaceX to ensure that they're ready to respond on Crew 9 for a contingency of returning Butch and Sunny on Crew 9 if we need that. We have set up the Dragon for Crew 9 to have flexibility to have only 2 passengers fly up on that flight, and then we could return 4 crew members in the February 2025 timeframe, and Butch and Sunny would remain on station and become part of that increment and return home with them on Crew 9. Now, we haven't approved this plan. In other words, we've done all the work to make sure this plan is there. We have the suits identified to fly up on Crew 9. We have the seats set up so that we can fly a multiple complement of people, but we have not turned that on formally as that's the path that we're going to go down. But we wanted to make sure we had all that flexibility in place. We'll fly up the supplies needed on that Crew 9 flight, including any suits needed for Butch and Sunny. We've done previous work with that for other contingencies. And we'll have the right foam inserts to work on all the seats for the various crew members. We've had a lot of discussion and questions about task orders recently, and I would say, we've done a lot of work in Commercial Crew to prepare for multiple contingency options. The first one is, and we want to be open and transparent about those options, the first one is to have an option in Dragon on the cargo pallet to fly 1 crew member, a total of 5 crew members down in a contingency only. And so we had a task order in place to go do that work, and that's out there. And so that work has been completed, and we now have modified the capability to not use a seat liner, but also use the foam. On Crew 9, we now have the capability to fly 2 crew members up and have ballast in the seats for that, and then return a total of 4 crew members with the right seats. We actually put out a task order with SpaceX to do that work, and that task order is out there in place, and SpaceX has completed an initial part of that work, and then there's a final part of the work to configure the vehicle for the two-crew option and complete training for the crew for that option. And then finally, there's one more task order that we have worked on. In the event that we have to undock Starliner first in an uncrewed configuration, we have a task order in place to allow up to 3 crew members on the cargo pallet using a foam configuration in the Crew 8 Dragon. So we've done a lot of contingency work and a lot of contingency planning for a lot of scenarios, but we think now we would have the whole waterfront covered. As I said, we haven't really implemented planning for the mission for these things, but we have all these items in place to keep all the options on the table. I want to clarify a couple things relative to the uncrewed Starliner configuration relative to undock. That Starliner has the capability to undock in an uncrewed configuration. However, the mission data loads for this flight, the flight software we have on board today, are set up for a crewed undock. And what that means is, in close to station, for docking and undocking, the failure response matrix in the software downloads to a crew manual capability for any breakouts. In order to do the uncrewed version, we'll have to go in and change these mission data loads and verify those through the Boeing Integrated Hardware Software Test Facility before we go fly that. There would be also additional training that the Boeing flight control team would have to undergo, and some work to go lay out all that work. So the software on Dragon is fine, or on Starliner is fine. It can actually handle the capability to do an uncrewed undock. It's exactly what we did on OFT-2. We just have to go configure some software parameters, not change the software to go do so. I think we've talked about all the scenarios. I want to reiterate we haven't made a decision yet relative to return Butch and Sunny on Starliner or on Dragon on Crew 9. We appreciate your patience. It's been a very complicated time frame. There's been a lot of work going on across all different entities relative to this work. I want to say how proud I am of the NASA, the Boeing, and the SpaceX team for having their head down and doing all the requisite work to make all these options viable for the program. We are in a unique position in Commercial Crew where we have all these options now, and we will use the right option at the right time. And so the decision point is ahead of us, and I will turn it over to Dana Weigel.
All right, thank you, Steve. Good afternoon. Thank you very much for joining us today. You know, as Ken noted, we take the accurate and timely sharing of information very seriously, and so I hope I can share with you the most up-to-date and relevant information on the ISS side related to onboard activities. On board right now we have 6 spacecraft attached to station with the arrival of Northrop Grumman 21 Cygnus mission recently. We have a number of spacecraft arrivals and departures that are upcoming in the next few weeks. We have a departure of Progress 87P on August 12th. We've got the arrival of the next Progress, which is 89P, on August 17th. Next arrival of the Soyuz 72S will be on September 11th. That'll be carrying NASA astronaut Don Pettit. And then after a handover period, the 71S Soyuz will depart on September 23rd with Tracy Dyson. One of the things in this scenario that Steve laid out for you in terms of vehicle sequencing, given that we have only 2 docking ports on board, and right now we've got Crew 8 vehicle on board and we've got Starliner on board. Before we launch Crew 9, we will need to undock the Starliner first, so that's first in the sequence of events. So after Starliner undocks, we'll launch Crew 9, and as Steve said, that's now moved to late September. Of course, the crew will do a handover, and then Crew 8 would leave about a week later. And around the corner after that, we will launch our SpaceX 31 Dragon cargo resupply mission. I know in previous briefings I've mentioned that it's been helpful to have the extra set of hands on board with Butch and Sunny. They've been continuing to help us out quite a bit with maintenance and getting extra science done on board, which we really appreciate. I do want to highlight a few other special topic, a few other things for you. For Northrop Grumman, for that mission. That carried over 8,200 pounds of critical resupply, spares, crew supplies, and science. So the crew right now is spending their time unloading it. It's pretty busy the first couple days that a vehicle comes up. There's a lot of critical science and research and a lot of things that they need to get to in the first few days, so that's what they're focused on. I do want to commend our Northrop Grumman and our NASA teams for the work they did addressing an engine burn execution issue that was encountered uphill. Shortly after launch, the spacecraft, the Cygnus's onboard limit detection system flagged an out-of-limit calculated parameter, so it takes a number of different inputs. It does a calculation, and that violated a limit, and it did what it was designed to do, and it canceled the burn. The Northrop team took a close look at all of the individual engine parameters and determined that all of the hardware was actually functioning within acceptable limits. That calculation is a little bit more conservative, and so they reworked the far-field rendezvous plan to keep us on time with our planned arrival time. It was pretty impressive to watch them do that, and of course that was important to us because there's a lot of science and research that has limited time frames that it can handle between launch and arrival. So they did a fantastic job recovering and reworking the plan after that burn issue they had. Yesterday's capture of NG-21 was actually the 50th free flyer capture that we've done on board station. Of course, we used the SSRMS or Canadarm2 to do that, and that's pretty impressive. The first one was about 15 years ago. It was HTV-1. That was on September 17, 2009, and I'm kind of tickled by that data point because I was the lead flight director for HTV-1, and I remember sitting on console that day, first time we'd ever tried to capture a free-flying vehicle with a robotic arm, and pretty impressive now to think that we've now done 50 of those. And then as I mentioned, Progress 89P is coming up, and of course that is loaded with a lot of food, propellant, and supplies for the Expedition 71 crew. I want to give a little bit more detail to what Steve talked about with the task orders, and we understand there's been a lot of confusion. We do a lot of work off and on with SpaceX for any number of different scenarios and contingencies, and so they're not specifically new activities for us, but just to give you a little more detail, the task order that was issued to SpaceX in mid-July was developed to support a contingency return capability for Tracy Dyson, similar to what we did with Frank Rubio. If you recall with Frank Rubio, after we had the Soyuz coolant loop leak, we put in place a capability that allowed for a 5-crew return with the Dragon. When we did that, we used the Soyuz seat liner as the cushion on the Dragon cargo pallet for Frank. And what we realized after that is ideally we wouldn't be taking the Soyuz seat liner and moving it. It is vulnerable to damage when you pull it out and you move it around. And so we worked in a solution that uses a foam, just different foam basically for the cushioning, and didn't require us to move the seat liner. So that gives us a lot more flexibility and doesn't put that Soyuz seat liner at risk. So that's the work that we had SpaceX do in mid-July, and that's actually the generic contingency configuration that we plan to use for all of our Soyuz crew members if we ever encountered a Soyuz vehicle issue and needed to use the Dragon. And then as Steve mentioned, we also increased that number to 7 just so that we have a full range of capabilities for future contingencies. We are really fortunate that we've got evolving capabilities in a framework that allows us to put in place alternate crew contingency options. I think the Soyuz coolant leak taught us quite a bit. You know, we'd always been protecting for anomalies on board station, but you know, you can have any number of an anomaly on a crew vehicle too, whether it's a micrometeoroid strike or anything else. So smart for us to always have backup plans in place. Steve mentioned the specific backup plan for Starliner, and just to give you a few other pieces to that plan, if we did fly up Crew 9 with 2 crew, our plan is to leave Butch and Sunny on board to execute the rest of that expedition. They would return on Crew 9 with the normal crew rotation timing. A couple years ago, we made the decision, knowing that this was a test flight, to make sure that we had the right resources, supplies, and training for the crew, just in case they needed to be on ISS for whatever reason for a longer period of time. So Butch and Sunny are fully trained. They're capable and current with EVA, with robotics, with all the things we need them to do. Of course, as you know, they have both actually done expeditions on board station previously. They've also done EVAs for us. I did pre-position their EVA gear earlier in the year just to have that on board, so they've got suits that fit them, and so no issue or challenge with them performing the increment if we really had to do that. And to reiterate what Steve said, those are backup contingency plans. We have not made any decisions at all in terms of anchoring to a specific plan. I hope that helps fill in some of the blanks and keeps you guys fully informed with our latest. And with that, I will turn it back over to Leah.
Thank you, Ken, Steve, and Dana, for all that information. Again, thanks to everyone who's tuned in online. We'll move into the question and answer portion of our conversation today. A reminder, press *1 to raise your hand and be admitted into the queue, and press *2 to lower it if you've heard your question answered. And as mentioned earlier, I will be turning over this portion of the call to Holly, our operator online. So, Holly, I'll let you take it away.
Thank you. Our first caller is Marcia Dunn with the Associated Press. You may go ahead. Your line is open.
Yes, hi. I'm hoping you can hear me. For Steve, Ken, or both, after so many critical problems, how can NASA have any faith in bringing Butch and Sunny home in the Starliner, no matter how many more tests or patches are done?
Yeah, I'll start, Marcia, and then I'll hand it over to Ken. I think if we step back and look at the two big issues we've been working on orbit, really the helium leaks and the thruster issues, I think, the key attribute really to moving forward for the rest of the flight is to understand how those systems are used for the remainder of the flight and what the demand is on both the helium system, which is primarily the deorbit burn, and also the thrusters, which is the deorbit burn. And so we're really trying to understand the usage of the thrusters for the deorbit burn, and then also really delve into the physics of what's happening. I think if we could replicate the physics in some offline testing to understand why this poppet is heating up and extruding, and then why it's contracting, that would give us additional confidence to move forward, to return Butch and Sunny on this vehicle. That's what the team is really striving to do, to try to look at all the data and see if we can get a good physical explanation of what's happening. And I'll see if Ken has anything to add.
Yeah, I'll just add a little bit more there, Steve. I think your description was really good. Marcia, we try not to just make decisions based on how we feel about something, right? What we try to do is go in and be data-driven, look very closely at what we've got in the way of data and then and analysis, bring in experts, and try to pin down what our risk is. When we started this mission, it was a test mission. We knew that it potentially had a higher risk than a flight on a vehicle that has more experience, more flights on it, right? So we're at the point now where we see additional risk that's in a fairly broad uncertainty band, depending on how much data and how much understanding you have. You might take a different view of where we are in that risk band. But switching off of our primary path of bringing Butch and Sunny home on Starliner causes us to take additional risk in the rest of our mission profile. And so we have to compare all those risks, and we'll weigh all that as we make our final decision.
Our next caller is Gina Sunseri with ABC News. You may go ahead.
I think this is probably for Dana, but How did Butch and Sunny react to this announcement? Are they excited about potentially 6 more months up there, or however many months for Crew 9?
I would say it wasn't an announcement. So Butch and Sunny are aware that we're always looking at contingency plans. I mean, this is a pretty common thing that we do. We've always got backup plans. Of course, they knew, before they flew that they had been fully trained, on board. The ground team has done a great job talking with Butch and Sunny and keeping them included in all of the discussions. In fact, I'll let Steve share, but he's had some recent board meetings where they participated. Butch and Sunny are ready to support, and they trust the ground teams. They're ready to support whatever we need to do. They're great crew members, great astronauts, great at flying Starliner. So I'd say they're prepared for either path that we go down, and let me hand it to Steve to share a little bit more insight with you in terms of communications with Butch and Sunny.
Yeah, I would say, Gina, we continue daily, weekly to update Butch and Sunny. They will, the great news is the station has a lot of capability. They can dial into our meetings. They dialed into our program control board last Tuesday, and we're able to sort of hear all the different various opinions of where we're at and all the data that we've been putting together and all the different risk assessments. So they're getting that data. I think Butch and Sunny are ready to do whatever we need them to do. They could be coming home on Starliner, before September 24th. As Dana said, we haven't made a decision yet, right, of whether we pursue the rest of the mission and complete it nominally, as Ken said, or we have Starliner come home in an uncrewed configuration. So that's a decision ahead of us. Knowing Butch and Sunny, they are professional astronauts and test pilots, and they understand the difficulties of the decisions that we're faced. They have complete confidence in the ground teams, and then they'll do what we need them to do.
Our next caller is Jackie Waddles with CNN. You may go ahead.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for hopping on. I think I speak for a lot of us when I say I hope that we can get more frequent updates like this. It's been a couple weeks now since we've had updates on Starliner, and also would really love to be able to hear from your Boeing counterparts in situations like this. So for my question, I just want to follow up on some reporting from my colleague Eric Berger. So it sounded like behind the scenes there was some pretty serious concern about if Starliner has certain thrusters fail during undocking, that it could pose a threat to the ISS or become uncontrolled. Can you tell us if that's true, if that's something that's really being discussed behind the scenes? And if so, how big are those concerns? How widespread are those concerns? Thanks so much.
I'll start at a high level, and then I'll let Steve fill you in. So our strategy, we have fault tolerance for any number of things. So we've got sufficient fault tolerance for undocking, so we're not concerned about the, let's say, immediate proximity around ISS. The other thing that we've done in the past with the vehicle, the attitude that we're in when Starliner undocks is I'll call it a passive release attitude. So even if, for example, the vehicle did nothing and just drifted out, it's on a safe trajectory for ISS. That's not the state the vehicle would be in, but that's an added, let's say, layer of conservatism that is already there. And so I'm not sure what the specific concern is that you're referring to, but there is plenty of fault tolerance, plus there is safe, complete drift-out trajectory if none of the thrusters were working at all. So Steve, you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I would just say, from a thruster perspective, the biggest demand on the thrusters for the remaining portion of the flight is really the deorbit burn. There'll be a few thruster firings to back away from ISS, and then a burn to basically take it over the top of ISS, and then I would say below ISS, and then moves out in front of ISS. Those firings aren't that stressing on the thrusters. Where we get into the next part of the flight, and again, the heating is not nearly what we saw on the day of rendezvous when the thrusters are firing very rapidly, not only to keep Starliner pointed toward the ISS, but also to fly it up the corridor and into the docking area. But but the Deobert burn has a number of firings as the OMAC engines, the orbital maneuvering and thruster control engines, fire for the Deobert burn. 4 of those. The RCS thrusters will fire to hold the orientation of Starliner to make sure it's pointed in the right direction to get all the thrust you need out of the engines, and that's the next stressing case. So it's really, the real concern is how many thrusters can we have fail off? We've done a lot of analysis that have shown that you can have significant number of the aft thrusters fail. In fact, you could have 4 failures of the aft thrusters, and we would still have great attitude control during the Deobert burn. And then after the Deobert burn, we need to maneuver to an attitude to separate the crew module and the service module. And then for that SEP sequence, the aft thrusters aren't required at all. Just want to clarify one other thing on the software. The software that's used, whether it be crewed or uncrewed, is the same software, the exact same flight software. What would need to be updated is a specific set of mission parameters, we call those mission data loads, to get into the uncrewed configuration. So the software doesn't have to be changed. The trajectory is the same. It really is on the software side, it's just some contingency mission data parameters in the software that if a crew weren't there, the software could then execute the checking and any response needed in close to ISS.
Our next caller is Bill Harwood with CBS News. You may go ahead.
Thank you. I think this is for Steve. Can you clarify what the actual risks are with the return? In other words, what I'm asking is, what's the worst case, given what you know about the health of the OMACs and the past problems with the RCS jets? You just mentioned you could fail off a bunch of them. It sounds like, and please correct me if I'm wrong, that as long as the OMACs fire, you're going to come down, and the crew would survive that. They might not land where they wanted to, or is it worse than that? I don't understand. I understand keeping it stable during the burn, but I'm not understanding what the worst case failure here is that you guys are spending all this time trying to protect against.
Yeah, that's a good question, Bill. I think it's really the worst case would be some integrated failure mechanism between the helium leaks and the RCS thrusters. And so for a nominal Deobert burn, as I talked about, we fire 1 OMAC in each of the 4 doghouses. And then the RCS jets are just there to hold the orientation. And, essentially we could lose a number of jets. It's really the multiple failure cases where if you lost if you had a helium leak in a certain doghouse and that took out the OMAC in that doghouse, then you could end up with some cases that aren't as easily controlled. And that's really the more stressing cases that the team is worried about. And then the team also really does want to understand the physics. Our white sands testing shows some degradation in thrust over time, which would be acceptable. The team also wants to understand the worst case ramifications of getting the thruster hot. So far, we have seen on the flights, on multiple occasions, we've got the thrusters very hot, but they also want to make sure there's no particular failure mode if the thruster gets too hot that we haven't seen yet. So I think it's more along the lines of looking at the most extreme cases on the thruster that the team's off looking at.
Our next caller is Micah Maidenberg with the Wall Street Journal. You may go ahead.
Thank you. Hi, all. Boeing said last week that data supports flight rationale for using Starliner to take Butch and Sunny back to Earth. I guess, Ken and Steve, just from where you sit, are you personally in agreement with that view from Boeing, or you prefer one of the contingency plans discussed, or are you still waiting? And just wherever you are on that, could you please explain kind of the magnitude of debate within NASA about using Starliner to return the crew members? Like, how many people, for example, on the program control board are currently opposed to that? Thanks.
Well, why don't I start, Steve, and then you can kind of finish and tell Micah about the PCB. As I mentioned before, I think reasonable people could have different views on which path we should take. I don't think anybody is taking a view that you could prove is wrong or right. What we've got is an uncertainty band, and the Boeing team, because of their experience and their belief in the resilience of their hardware, that would take them to being very confident that the vehicle could bring the crew home, even right now with the uncertainty that we've got. But we've got other folks that are probably a little more conservative. They're worried that we don't know for sure, so they estimate the risk higher, and they would recommend that we avoid coming home because we have another option, right? We could put the crew on a Dragon. So that's part of the discussion that we're having right now. But again, I think both views are reasonable with the uncertainty band that we've got, and so our effort is trying to reduce that uncertainty. Steve, anything you want to throw in there?
No, Ken, I think you said it. I'll throw a couple things in, but you said it really well. It's about the uncertainty in the data. I think Boeing asserted their vehicle was ready to come home on Friday with a blog post they put out. They listed all the testing that we have accomplished jointly between Boeing and NASA in that blog, which was good. We've done a fair amount of testing. I think it depends on your experience base a little bit as to how you view the risk. Boeing is looking at the risk from the thrusters based on what they've observed more in previous flights, all the way back to, if folks remember, in 2019 OFT-1, we failed off 9 thrusters, I think it was, very early in the flight due to a problem getting the OI burn off and had some severe heating, a number of pulses on that flight. I think Boeing looks at the flight performance on this flight, the flight performance on that flight, and the testing at White Sands and draw some conclusions. I think the NASA community in general would like to understand a little bit more of the root cause and the physics. And then what uncertainty is there relative to the root cause and the physics. I think those are the two different views, different opinions, and we're trying to work to get a solution for both of those.
Our next question comes from Joey Roulette with Reuters. You may go ahead.
Thanks. Just wanted to follow up on Micah and Bill's question for Steve or Ken. Can you kind of quantify the disagreements that the NASA team is voicing during these meetings or the Program Control Board? Like, what number of dissents or disagreements are you having compared to those who are supporting the data, or otherwise? And then real quick for Steve, who comes off, or for Dana, who comes off of Crew 9 under the contingency plan? Would that be NASA astronauts or the Roscosmos astronaut? Thanks.
Yeah, I'll address the latter question first and then talk about the disagreements a little bit. We're not really ready to share the data on which crew members. I think we'll do that at the appropriate time, should we employ that option. Relative to the disagreements, I don't want to, I think the best way to characterize it is the way I said it, right? People with various levels of experience look at uncertainty differently, and so the real disagreements are how much uncertainty they view in the data and how much risk level they view relative to Starliner. And now we actually, for the first time, I think ever in human spaceflight, while docked ISS have 2 U.S. vehicles to choose from in some respect, Dragon and Starliner. And so we knew the test flight would be riskier. The Dragon Demo 2 test flight was risky as well when we flew Bob and Doug in May of 2020. Now that we have had the helium leaks on orbit and we've had the thruster fail off, some in the team don't see that level of risk something that we should entertain. And I think that's where we're having the vigorous debates and discussions at the PCB and then at other levels, trying to gather up the rest of the data that maybe will help bring some other piece of data in that helps lower that uncertainty in their characterization of the risk.
Yeah, and just to give you a feel, we don't really count we don't vote, right? We don't go through and do any type of percentage as part of our process. Just one disagreeing voice can be enough, right, to sway the whole team to move a different direction. But I'd say we heard from a lot of folks that had concern, the decision was not clear. Right? We heard enough voices that the decision was not clear at the Program Control Board.
And our next question comes from Michael Sheets with CNBC. You may go ahead.
Thank you. Appreciate it. Given what Ken said at the beginning of the call and the variety of factors at play, I think 1-hour press briefings that don't even happen once a week aren't quite cutting it, especially when the briefings try to cover multiple topics at once. But I'll stick my questions to Starliner because that's the one I really want an answer on. Now that Crew 9's been pushed back a month, what are the timeline constraints on making a decision about Starliner's return? Or in other words, how long do you have to make a decision on Starliner's return, and when do you need to make that decision by?
Yeah, we're in the process of laying that data out right now. I mean, we've authorized Boeing to go lay out the plan, not execute, but lay out the plan for what it would be, what would be required to do the uncrewed undock, and that will get a first look at that schedule probably early next week. Remember that the flight control team for Boeing has trained to do the crewed undock with the crewed parameters in the software, and so we want to go make sure before we execute that we would dust that off. And then again, there's some changes for things that are automated responses with an uncrewed version versus the crew, and so we want to go lay all that work out. When we lay that work out, I think we need to probably decide, likely in the middle of August, one path or the other, to go ahead and meet the launch date for Crew 9 on the 24th. Given what Dana said, we really would like to undock Starliner first to free the port up, and then when we do that, we want to lay in some number of landing opportunities for Starliner. The opportunities are about every 4 days. We have opportunities in September starting on the 2nd and the 6th and about every 4 days, so we want to lay those in as well. So roughly mid-August we need to decide, and we're kind of laying out that path this week.
And our next caller is Lauren Grush with Bloomberg. You may go ahead.
Hi. Thank you so much. This is for Steve or Ken, kind of following up on Michael's question. I'm just curious, what does the next few weeks look like for you? How is this decision going to get made, and who ultimately makes the call about how Starliner will come home?
Yeah, you want me to? You go ahead and explain the process there a little bit, Steve, and then I can weigh in.
Yeah, absolutely, Ken. I would love your thoughts. We need to basically follow up from the Program Control Board we had, where we laid out data, but we didn't necessarily poll in a way that led to a conclusion, I would say. We have new data coming in. I failed to mention we have brought in extra propulsion experts from across NASA, from the Jet Propulsion Lab, from the Glenn Research Center, and from the Goddard Space Flight Center as well. To help, they are meeting here this week to see if there's some data that perhaps we have missed. They're working in concert with our commercial crew prop team and Aerojet Rocketdyne. So once we get all that data together, we'll have to come to the Program Control Board, see if we've closed all the actions as well from the previous Program Control Board, then take that to an agency flight readiness review, make a recommendation to Ken, and then depending on how that meeting goes, there could be another step with Jim Free and ultimately the administrator, and I'll see if you have anything to add, Ken.
No, I think you summarized it really well, Steve. The way it would work is it comes to the flight readiness review. I chair that review. We'll poll everybody, see where we are. I'll state what my position is at that time. If we have dissenting voices out of that meeting, then it can go to the associate administrator, and if there's a desire to go even further, it can go to the administrator. The administrator, though, it's important to understand that the decision-making authority I have is delegated from the administrator. Same thing with the associate administrator, right? The administrator ultimately takes responsibility and has a very important concern and responsibility for the final decision. So he will be involved.
And our next caller is Chris Davenport with the Washington Post. You may go ahead.
Hi, thanks so much. Quick, can you certify Starliner if it comes back without crew? Is that theoretically possible? And then just a quick follow-up on Bill Harwood's question about the worst-case scenario. Steve, you were talking about understanding the heat generated by the thrusters and understanding the worst-case scenarios. I just wonder if there's any concerns about the heat inside the doghouse, if that could affect the propellant lines or even ignite the propellant. I think you had said something about concerns about the propellant vaporizing, but I wonder if it gets hot enough, if there could be a more adverse effect. Thank you.
Yeah, I'll take the first question relative to certification. We're laying out that data right now. If we had an uncrewed undock and brought Starliner back safely, I think we would look at all that data. There are many things that are the same with or without a crew. We would have to look at the things that are really needed for a crew on board, like how the ecosystem performs with the crew and so forth, and lay that out. Boeing has already moved out on changes to the helium system. We've talked about the seal that is leaking. Remember the P2D2 flange that leaked pre-flight? They've already moved out on a replacement seal. They're already laying in additional testing for the thrusters to make sure that we hit all the corners of the box on the thrusters. They're already looking at various changes to the flight software and the way it flies, such that it doesn't put as much many pulses on the thrusters and cause the additional heating. Relative to the worst case question on igniting the propellants, right now, the propellants are separate from each other, so you would have to get enough heat to actually rupture a line, and so we don't really see that as a concern. What the doghouses are really doing to us is keeping the heat in, and such that sometimes even when we fire an OMAC, we can get heat soaked back over from that OMAC into the RCS thruster. So we don't really see it as a ignition risk or a concern of combustion inside the doghouse. It really is more about will the thrusters fail off during the deorbit burn or some other time.
And our next caller is Kenneth Chang with the New York Times. You may go ahead.
Hi, thank you. This is for Steve Stitch. Basically, what changed and when and why? I asked you back on July 10th whether there were any contingency plans for Dragon, and you said, quote, certainly we've dusted off a few of those things to look at relative to Starliner just to be repaired. What you described today goes way beyond that. Was that July answer accurate, or when did you decide to actually get these extended plans started? Thank you.
Yeah, I think I'd have to go back and look at the timing. We started in early July doing some early planning with SpaceX for some of these contingencies. Then as we got closer and a little bit more data, we started to put a few more things in place on Dragon. We have this contingency option that we've been working a little bit more in the background for a while. In the last few weeks, we have decided to make sure we have that capability there. As our community, I would say, got more and more uncomfortable with the uncertainty in the thrusters, I think that, to me, upped the priority in having this capability in place. And really, what we have done is totally reversible. We can fly Crew 9 as planned, as we've been planning for years with 4 crew members, and we can plan to fly it with 2 crew members. And so as we got further and further into it and heard more from the team and the uncertainty that Ken talked about and I've talked about,
the Department of Transportation and everyone who is working on making this project more accessible to Portland, and really incorporating into the wonderful things that are going on in our city and making sure everyone can have those opportunities of spending time here. We're also here to welcome our wonderful Secretary of Transportation, Secretary Buttigieg. Thank you so much for coming to visit Maine. We're thrilled to have you here. We all know the Secretary has a huge fan club across the country, but he's seen it here in Maine. Everywhere he's gone, people have been stopping him, shaking his hand, asking for a picture, and I think we all know why. I've been so fortunate to serve with the Biden-Harris administration, and the